and I was pulling out of the parking lot to leave work that morning, and I didn't see a car coming around the bend on the highway. There was like a truck coming around the bend there.
Mhm.
And I pulled out and it just slammed right into my driver's side door. Then there was just like black, nothing for a while. I think that actually starts a different kind of process in the brain and in consciousness when your body actually dies. All that was there was basically my body and a bright light, like bright, pure, like divine light, like God or whatever you
Mhm.
want to call it, source, God, I don't know. I didn't know what to call it. I didn't believe in God.
I want to welcome everybody back to another episode of The Soul Inspired. Today, I'm excited to have Justin Birkholz on with us. He has had an NDE and he's also had some spiritual experiences in his life. We're going to go through all of that with him. But first of all, Justin, thanks for being on the show today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
I'm glad we got to talk a little bit before we started, get to know each other
Yeah.
a little bit. One of the oddest things about doing a podcast, a lot of times I don't know who I'm talking to, and then it comes on, and I'm
Yeah.
like, okay, I've got to like get into the energy of this person, and it's pretty cool. I almost feel like some of this is just set up correctly. I haven't often felt, uncomfortable talking to the person that's coming on.
That's
So
good.
yeah, I appreciate you coming on today and telling us about what's happening. So I always kind of start with this first question, and it's if you think about the first experience you ever had, maybe it was the NDE in your life. If you think about that, but you think about who you were before that, you know, have you changed? Were you a different person? Who was Justin before the experience actually happened?
Yeah, I have completely changed. So anyone who knew me, let's see, 10 or 15 years ago, would say that I've just completely changed as a person, my habits, routines, my interests, everything, beliefs, everything has pretty much changed. And it didn't happen, immediately when I had my near death experience. It was kind of a like a 2-year kind of process, like a chrysalis kind of a process where everything in my old life was broken down and
Mm.
then kind of reformed into a new me, a new interest. And so before all of that, what happened was that I grew up in a very religious family, Protestant, Christian, conservative American kind of, all American type family. I had great parents, good brothers, all that, but I wasn't exactly uh, satisfied with that kind of worldview and kind of lifestyle. It just didn't quite fit with me, and so as like a teenager and a young adult, I started to kind of rebel against that, or kind of become more anti-religious. I had like an atheist phase, I guess you could say. My late teens, early 20s, that kind of time. And I really didn't know what to make of like spirituality, like coming from a very religious family and then kind of turning against that. I just kind of said, wow, there's nothing to any of it. Like, I don't care about anything spirituality or meditation or whatever. I was like, none of that matters. I was very much just focused on like material reality, like how am I going to pay my bills. I want to go out and drink with my friends on the weekend. That was basically my concern, and all that I was really focused on for a long time. And in my mid 20s, um, I I was like always healthy and athletic, growing up. I played a lot of sports and stuff, but then in college I stopped playing sports. And I wasn't exercising as much, and I was like eating poorly and like drinking and stuff, and so my health was kind of not great. And I was still very young. So I started to get a little bit concerned about that and started thinking, oh, maybe I should change my lifestyle up a little bit. If I'm already not feeling well and I'm only 25, that's not good.
Right.
How am I going to feel when I'm, 50 or whatever? So I started like, oh, maybe I should try out this yoga thing. Maybe I should, start eating a little better. And then about 6 to 9 months after that, I was working. And at the time, I was working as a restaurant manager. And I would come in, we would get our shipment of food one day a week, and our truck would arrive at around midnight with all of our food for the restaurant. So we're talking like a couple hundred boxes that all weigh between 20 and 50 pounds that would need to be unloaded off the truck and loaded into our walk-in cooler and back of house and all that. And so one day a week, I would work overnight. I would show up when the closing manager was kind of closing up shop. I would come in and do inventory, and then I would unload the truck and load everything by myself. I was just there by myself at night.
Okay.
And so I would work like 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. And then when the opening manager was coming in, I would leave. And so this was in Seattle area as well. And on a January morning, I was set to leave work at 6 a.m. in Seattle. And so it's pitch black still, foggy. There's like no visibility. And the restaurant I worked at was on a highway. And I was pulling out of the parking lot to leave work that morning. And I didn't see a car coming around the bend on the highway. There was like a truck coming around the bend there.
Mm-hmm.
And I pulled out and it just slammed right into my driver's side door. It
Oh, wow.
didn't even slow down or anything. The police report said that it was going at highway speed, whatever that means, but essentially really fast, probably around 50 miles per hour or so. And it just slammed directly into my driver's side door. Um, so
So
yeah,
so you're leaving work at the end of your shift.
yeah. After working all night long, staying
Right.
up literally all night. Yeah.
Right. And I'm not sure who was in the wrong. I'm sure it sounds like he was in the wrong, the person who hit you, or
You
was it
know,
kind
I,
of
I'm not sure. The police report said that it was my fault because I pulled out too close to him, or whatever. I did, but I
right?
didn't see him because the way it was kind of like a bend that the restaurant was on, and the road curved around it.
Mm,
So he was kind of coming from where I couldn't see, but he was going really fast, and it was, like I said, pitch black and foggy.
right, right,
It's raining and stuff, so it was just
right.
no visibility, you
So
know.
yeah, so maybe a combination of him going a little too fast and you not being able to see him, and the next thing you
Yeah.
know, it's almost like a T-bone, like it, or did it hit
Oh
you
yeah.
right? Yeah, so he just hit you
Yeah.
straight on the driver, and here you are
Yeah.
to tell the story, which is incredible because
Yeah.
not everyone sees the next day after that, or you know what I mean? It's like that's it
Yeah.
usually. Um,
Yeah, I'm really fortunate in a lot of ways because my whole driver's side of my car was destroyed. So what happened was it hit me so hard my car spun around 180 degrees and I was actually facing backward and I was in the middle of the highway and there's
wow.
cars flying by and it kind of knocked me unconscious for a second when I got hit and I like woke up and I couldn't get out my driver's side door. So I actually somehow managed to crawl out the passenger side door of my car and up onto the side of the road. And I called 911 myself on the side of the road. There's like blood pouring out of my face because I have shards of glass stuck into my face because my driver's side window shattered and it just went straight into the side of my like face and neck. There's like big
Oh
shards
my
of glass
goodness.
just stuck into me and shattered all the bones in the left side of my body too, basically. Like the whole left side of my face, it was broken in three places. One of the sutures where the bones in your skull come together
Hmm.
actually separated too, because I got hit so hard. And it shattered the left side of my rib cage too, just broke like all the bones. It was awful,
Wow.
absolutely horrible. So yeah, I remember calling 911 and then literally sitting there on the side of the road, drifting in and out of consciousness, because I had, severe traumatic brain injury.
Hmm.
Um, and eventually they showed up and they took me in an ambulance to Harborview, and that's when I kind of had my near death experience, as most people would think of it.
Okay.
So the EMTs picked me up and we were driving in an ambulance. Luckily, we were near a hospital called Harborview. That's like one of the main trauma centers in the whole Pacific Northwest. Like people are helicoptered in from multiple states away to go there. And I was fairly close. So I was really lucky in that regard to be right near there. But as I was driving in the ambulance, I was going in and out of consciousness, and the EMTs were like trying to keep me alive,
Yeah. Yeah.
as I was there, and they're like cutting my clothing off of me, because they can't take it off, normally and all this stuff. And I just remember being gone for a while, like really not being sure if I was going to live, as I'm sitting there on the side of the road and as the EMTs are driving me. And there's just this crazy feeling of like, is this it? Yeah, like, am I going to die right here?
Hmm.
And then there was just like black, nothing for a while. And I didn't have the kind of experience where you see like a bright light or anything like that. Not at this time. Well, we'll get to that.
Okay.
I had that experience, but not right at this moment. And it was just like I was done. And then I have this really profound uh memory or experience of like coming back into my body and the EMTs being there over me and like, I don't know, wait, shaking me or like yelling or whatever they were doing. Um and this profound feeling of actually being here and like knowing that I was going to live. Like there was this long period where it was like I was dancing across the line of, life and death. And then all of a sudden it hit me like I was back in my body and I was going to stay there. I was actually going to live. And I'm in the ambulance and they're literally like cutting my clothing, my shirt and my jacket off of me. And I remember this very clearly. I just started smiling and crying, just crying tears of joy,
Wow.
because I knew I was going to live, because I was literally like, I'm dead. This is it. I'm going to die. It was how I felt while I
Hmm.
was, uh, on the road and in the ambulance. And then it was all of a sudden like, oh, okay, I'm gonna make it. No matter how messed up I am at this time, I'm gonna live. And it was just this overwhelming feeling of like being reborn, literally, getting like a second chance. And so right there, right then was when I decided there are a lot of changes I want to make in my
Mm.
life. It was like, I wanted to reconnect with my family. I wanted to invest more in my health and take it more seriously, you know?
Okay. Wow. Let me jump in. First of all, I want to thank
Yeah.
you for explaining it so far. This is a lot, right? So I don't know how long ago this was. I think you said you were 25 when this happened.
I was 28. So this was 7 years ago.
Okay, so it's just seven years ago. 7 years goes fast though. That wasn't that long ago, really.
No,
You know
no,
what
I
I
remember
mean?
it very clearly. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, no, and
Yeah.
I can feel you even explaining it. I can feel the emotion, right? Because you're reliving that part of it, which I can't
Yeah.
imagine. It's heavy. A lot of times when I'm talking to guests, I actually can feel their energy, and then I take these like big breaths, and I see
Yeah.
it back when I'm
Yeah.
doing the editing. I'm like, what am I doing? I'm not the one who experienced it, but I'm like holding my breath and having
Yeah.
all these like actual emotions through it. So
Yeah.
anyway, I always like to thank everybody for sharing the experience because that's a pretty dramatic moment in your life and something you went through. Um, just a couple things because before we continue with it, you had so again, you're in this accident, you get out of the vehicle, you call 911 yourself. I don't know what happened to the driver, if he was okay or not. I don't know what would have
The
went.
other driver was fine.
Okay.
He was in a
Okay.
big truck. I was in a tiny little Toyota Corolla. I
Oh,
mean,
wow.
he just destroyed my car and didn't even really do much to him. Bent his bumper and stuff, but yeah,
Right.
he
But
was
it
fine.
wasn't okay. Yeah. I
Yeah.
don't know why I like to, something inside me is like, was he okay? Like, I mean, not that it was good because it's like
Yeah,
in this
yeah, he was
situation, it
on
feels
the
like,
side of the road making sure I was alive when the EMTs
oh my
got there,
goodness.
but yeah,
Yeah. And I'm sure that was nerve-wracking for him too. So,
I'm
oh,
sure. Yeah.
right. So, okay. So you black out. This is one area I wanted to
Yeah.
jump in. So
Yeah.
you're going to the hospital and you have this black nothing memory. Now, I wanted to just know when you say this nothingness or this blackness, was it the same as did it feel as if you were like, when you go to sleep, sometimes we go to sleep, we wake up the next day, maybe we don't remember our dreams, but we know we kind of like went somewhere and came back. Is that what you mean by black nothingness, or what does it mean? Is there something more to it, something more
Yeah,
tangible?
it was not like that. It was like I didn't exist. Like I was gone. Like I wasn't asleep. I wasn't there was no memory. It was like I was coming in and out of existence. Um it's the best way I can kind of
Okay.
describe it.
Did you have
Yeah,
a fear around it,
very
or
disorienting.
was it just kind of like it just was what it was?
No, I was really afraid. Yeah, I felt like I was dying. I was very afraid that I was about to die at any second.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
maybe this is a question I could ask later, but I'm going to ask it now. In that place, um, because I mean, you hear about all these different experiences. People have all kinds of experiences, and we're going to talk about it. Maybe there was more of an experience you had, but in this nothingness part, this piece, what do you feel like that was? Was that kind of like a waiting period? Like, I mean, I don't think that's what we are at our ultimate would be this blackness. I mean,
No.
I wouldn't feel that. So I feel like, you were still consciously here on this in this earth, but something else was happening. Like, what is your take on that being the one that went through it? Where were you in that moment?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's really interesting because a lot of people have different kinds of near-death experiences depending on what happens to them. Some people they're in a hospital and they have cardiac arrest and they're, dead for a few minutes and then brought back to life or something like that. And they typically describe a different kind of experience than what I had at this time. So I'm not sure what to make of the different kinds of experiences that people have in a near death experience. I'm not sure if that's indicative of any kind of like ultimate reality or anything like that. Um, but I don't think that when we die, there's just nothing. I'm convinced that when we actually die, our consciousness goes on and goes through a kind of transformation to a different state, one that's not necessarily locally, captured or whatever.
Mhm.
So I think what I was experiencing was, yeah, like a kind of limbo state where my body and therefore my consciousness wasn't really sure if I was dead or alive, and so I was just waiting.
Right.
I was in like purgatory or something. I don't know,
Yeah.
whatever you want to call
Hmm.
it. But I think I
Hmm.
was kind of in between because when people's bodies actually die, from one or another reason, cardiac or brain or whatever, it seems that the a different kind of consciousness process actually starts at that moment, from
Yes.
what I've read and seen from people. I think that actually starts a different kind of process in the brain and in consciousness when your body actually dies. But since I don't think I was technically dead
Hmm.
at any point, even though my brain function was, going on, up and down or whatever, on and off, flickering maybe.
Hmm.
I don't think I fully started that process where it creates more of a visual experience, because I think that's what happens when when our body actually sends the signal to our consciousness that, hey, we're dead. I think it
Right.
starts as a more visual kind of experience that seems to have some similarities, from the
Mhm.
experiences that I've heard from people, but also a lot of differences, you know? And so I think some of it might be cultural, and I think some of it may be pointing to some kind of ultimate reality, but I'm not really sure.
Right. Yeah, I have heard of this darkness, this blackness, this void, this place that people
Yeah,
go to. And sometimes it's fearful and sometimes it's not fearful. And that's why I'm like, why,
sure.
but it could be like how far it's like you said, you hadn't crossed. So if you're
Yeah.
still ultimately here and your body's preparing itself to go there, you're kind of in this in between limbo mode where you haven't actually jumped through, there, will lead up to what happens next with this experience you had. But you, people talk about the tunnel or being in heaven and all these things that are more visual. Some
Mhm.
of them say, yeah, it's visual, but it's not visual the way it's more vivid. It's more real. It's
Yeah.
like going
Yeah.
from looking at a little black and white television to ultra 8K,
Mhm.
which is a completely different experience. So you
Yeah.
hadn't got there in this, you were just nothingness. And then when you came back, there was this relief of what I found interesting. You said you came back and you had this ultimate feeling like, oh, I'm gonna be okay. Like it's like you already knew, oh, I'm alive still, and somehow you had that convinced to yourself that you were gonna be okay. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know if you want to touch on that piece a little bit more, but I'm actually interested to see what happened next with this experience that you had as you went on with this.
Yeah. So that started a very interesting process in me, like I said, where I felt like I had been reborn and given this second chance, and I really wanted to make the most of it. But at the time, I was, really severely injured. So the next 2 years was a long recovery process for me, and it took about 2 full years to recover physically, mentally, emotionally. One of the hardest things for me was being a really, athletic, active person and doing the kind of active work that I did. I literally couldn't do that anymore. I couldn't unload my truck and do that for the restaurant anymore because my doctor told me you can't lift anything over 10 pounds because of all the injuries I had. So for me as a young, male, very proud of my physical abilities, that was probably the most difficult part for me to deal with was that mental struggle of not being physically capable and not knowing if I would ever be again because my left shoulder was injured, my left knee, my whole left side of my rib cage was fractured, the whole left side of my skull was fractured.
Yeah.
So, it was like I didn't know what I was going to do. Um, I couldn't really be physical with my partner. It was like all these things just made it very difficult for a long time. And I was in horrendous pain, just
Mhm.
absolutely ridiculous, awful pain for a long, long time. Um, and so I was on this journey, this process of trying to learn how to live with chronic pain, learn how to deal with these emotional, mental issues, struggles that I hadn't ever had to deal with before. And so that's when I really started turning more towards like spiritual practices, what people would describe as like meditation. I tried to get back into yoga once I could do do any of that
Yeah.
physically. Um, and I was a lot more intentional about my nutrition and diet, trying to eat a lot more vegetables and whole grains and stuff like that at that time, because I was really trying to cut down my inflammation because of all these bone fractures I had everywhere. Any amount of inflammation would just cause me all this pain in my face and my side and all this. So I uh, I started reading a lot of research, a lot of scientific research on diet and on health
Mm.
and wellness, and I started getting really interested in that.
Yeah.
And trying to recover at the same time, and I was doing like physical therapy and all that kind of stuff. And it was almost exactly 2 years later, and I was still in some chronic pain, and I was struggling, like, am I just gonna be in pain every day forever,
Mm.
for the rest of my life? Because it was hard to deal with that. And so I was like, maybe I should try this mindfulness meditation thing, because they actually started teaching it to people in hospitals. I don't know if you know the story of how that kind of started here in the US.
No.
But John Kabat-Zinn, who's one of the main teachers of mindfulness here in the US, he actually started at a hospital on the East Coast, and he was teaching this 8-week mindfulness course to people who had chronic pain or people who had terminal illness, to help them deal with the pain and the mental aspect of that. And they had a lot of success with this program. And so he wrote a book called Full Catastrophe Living, I believe it's called, which is an excellent book. And it teaches you the whole program and how to kind of guide yourself through it. And so I started that, and was seeing some help, uh, just because mindfulness meditation, you just have to sit with your feelings and your thoughts and yourself. And so when you're dealing with something like chronic pain, it can be really helpful to sit with that for a little bit and not constantly try and fight against it, or escape it. Because whenever you're trying to just escape that pain all the time, it ends up causing you more tension, and you cause other health problems because you're compensating, and it causes a lot of mental anguish.
Right.
And so it helped me learn to sit with the discomfort, with the pain, etc., and be okay with that, and not constantly and immediately try and flee from it, run from it.
And that was through the mindfulness practice. Were they doing this at the hospital with you? Like because you were probably going back and forth for recovery, right? I would assume.
uh
Or
yeah, but I just did this on my
you
own.
did this on your own. Okay.
Yeah, I just started
Right.
doing it on my own. I was doing like physical therapy and stuff, through the hospital and with my doctor,
Right.
but I needed something more than that. I
Mm.
needed something above it. So I looked into this and found it that they had been teaching it in another hospital, not where I was, but you could buy the book and do it yourself. So around that time, I happened to um, meet someone who had access to what people call magic mushrooms, psilocybin,
Mm.
and I decided I wanted to try that, and see, if it was helpful at all. And it was something I had experience with previously, like years in the past, when I was much younger.
Right.
In my early 20s, I had, partied a lot, and I'd try them a few times, but never like seriously, just to have fun kind of thing. And this time I was in a very different headspace. Like I had
Mhm.
already had this experience where I really wanted to transform my life and myself, and that was something that I cared about at that time, was my own personal transformation. And so when that was my intent and my focus, and I had this experience with the psilocybin, it was totally different than anything else I'd ever experienced before. Because my intentions were completely different, my mindset was totally different. And so I think it really highlights, what people say, that you know, when it comes to things like plant medicine or psychedelics, set and setting really are of the absolute utmost importance, I think.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting, I haven't gone down the road of a lot of plant medicine with too many guests. I have a few that I'll be connecting with, and personally, I haven't had an experience with that with mushrooms, things like that. But I did, I always have had interest because I've known a few individuals in my life who I seen transform from being in a dark space in their I'd say late teenage years,
Hmm.
and finding out they were doing this and thinking, oh, they're just the typical teenagers trying to do this stuff. Next thing you know,
Yeah.
they're saying, oh, I had a breakthrough, and I'm like, what's a
Yeah.
breakthrough? And then seeing them completely change as like a personality shift, and eventually even not doing them anymore,
Yep.
because they did them for the period of the time they needed it. And then I think, oh wow, I had a really terrible bias against that. And,
Yeah.
not to tell everyone to go out and start doing mushrooms or anything. That is
No,
not what I'm
no,
saying
no.
here. But it, I had a different, I grew up with this idea of what they were. And it's kind of like what
Me
you
too.
said, when you're younger and you're partying, you're being goofy and you're doing things for different intentions, right? So
Yeah.
it's kind of
Yeah.
like people who do ayahuasca and stuff. And I've said that just sounds so out of control. Like some of the stories I've heard with ayahuasca, it's just very harsh on the body. And I said,
Yeah.
maybe if I really needed awakening, like if I really needed to wake up, I don't know. But interesting. So you came across this, you had the plant medicine, and were here's a question. When you did that, did you go into it with the intention of finding something out about yourself, or what was the main intention, and what happened when you did that? Like, was there an experience you had?
Yeah, really, really powerful experience. And I think the way I look at it is it was kind of one experience from the time I had that accident until the time I had this, powerful spiritual experience. Those 2 years, I see that all is linked.
Oh, wow.
It was like when a butterfly or a caterpillar goes into the cocoon and they have this transformative period, right, where their entire body kind of dissolves and reforms into something totally different. I look at that 2 years as like that cocoon period for me, where I was like in incubation and my
Hmm.
whole body was breaking down. Literally, I was in like awful, horrible pain the entire time.
Right.
And then I didn't have a specific intention going into it. My intention was to have some fun with my friends. I was just taking them with a couple friends. But my mindset going into it was very different than it had ever been in my life because I was so focused on my own health and wellness and wanting to change in my own personal transformation. You just wanting to be a better person. Um, was my focus at that time. And so I was really caught off guard because I was just like, oh, I've done this before many times. It had been years, but I was like, I know what I'm getting into.
Right.
I'll have a good time with my friends. This will be fun. And then it was like as soon as it started like kind of kicking in and my consciousness started shifting, I had a very different like urge than I normally do when I'm doing something like that. And I just felt like for some reason I was compelled to like go off on my own and be alone, which is very different. Normally, I want to like have a good time with my friends and listen to music and whatever.
Right.
And I just felt like I had to go off and be on my own. And so I just like walked down the hallway of my house and I wrote about this on my blog because it was a really interesting experience. I looked into the first room and I had some roommates who were living there. So they had their room set up with their stuff. And I looked in there and I could like see the like vibe of the room. People talk like a space has a certain vibe or
Yeah.
energy or feeling or whatever to it. I could like see it. Like I don't know how to describe it,
Wow.
like the color of the vibe of the room or something. And I was like, that's
Right.
not right. That's not the right vibe for me. So I walked down the hall to the next room and he was a big like technology guy. He had like a bunch of computers and LED lights and flat screens and stuff in his room, and it was very like technological. And I could like see that vibe, and I was like, no, that's not right either. I don't want that right now. And then I walked down to the other room, and there was like afternoon sunlight coming through these curtains into the room, and it was like this orange golden light in there, and it was just like beautiful and peaceful. I was like, okay, that looks really nice. I think I'm gonna go sit down in here,
Right.
and I had no idea what I was doing. I just like felt like I had to, and I was like,
Mhm.
okay. So I went in there and I closed the door and I was like feeling kind of awkward. I'm like, what am I doing right now? So I like turned some music on and I was sitting there and I was like, no, this doesn't feel right. I think I need to turn the music off. I think I need some like silence for some reason,
Mm.
some quiet. So I turned the music off and I sat on my bed and I just kind of laid back onto the bed. Like I sat down on the edge and just laid, flat. And it was like as soon as I did that, I had this uh, out of body experience, I guess,
Mhm.
where I felt like my body was laying down somewhere in my soul or spirit or whatever you want to call it, like separated from it. And I was off in some kind of spirit realm or something. And all that was there was basically my body and a bright light, like bright, pure, like divine light, like God or whatever you
Mhm.
want to call it, source, God, I don't know. I didn't know what to call it. I didn't believe in God. I was like,
Mhm.
I'm an atheist at this time still, right?
Wow. Even after the
Um,
accident.
yeah, yeah,
Okay. Okay.
yeah. Like I started caring about my health and wanting to be healthier and stuff, but I was still like, there's no God. I don't care about religion. That was my mindset.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, here I am, and I'm experiencing my soul that I didn't believe in, and I'm
Mm.
seeing some kind of thing that's like God that I also didn't believe in. So that was a very interesting experience. And basically what happened is I got this kind of message, if you want to call it that. I didn't hear any kind of actual voice or communication, but it was like I just like thoughts were just coming to me, like being beamed into my head or something like that. They were
Mhm.
coming from like within me or something. And I got these very specific messages about very specific things that I was dealing with, like physical pain in my body. And this message was like, you need to adjust your posture and straighten your right shoulder up and back exactly like this. And it was like very specific messages of like ways that I was holding myself and compensating still because of the injuries and how I could fix that
Mm.
and fix it, like very specific too. Like I had an issue with my jaw. I had TMJ up until this experience. And then in this experience, I got this message to like adjust my jaw this certain way, like a chiropractic move, and something
Right.
clicked and it clicked back into place. And it's like, it's been there and I haven't had TMJ since. Um,
Wow.
yeah. And there were a couple other things like that were like very specific, very like immediate kind of like applicable
Mm.
messages that I got. And the only way that I can kind of make sense of that is I was so skeptical and kind of like against anything spiritual that I think the only way I would have changed my mind about any of that is if there was something practical that came from the experience to prove to me that this was real or legitimate.
Right.
If you know what I mean, like
I
I
know
was
100% what
so
you mean.
hard-hearted that like unless there was something totally mind-blowing and like
Yeah.
immediately applicable, I would have just been like, oh, whatever. It was nothing. I was just on drugs or whatever. I just would have ignored it.
Right.
And so I think God or my higher self or whatever it was that was communicating with me in that place knew that and knew that I needed these specific, instructions to care about it for it to really make a difference. And it wasn't just physical. There were like mental things too. It's like, hey, you keep getting stuck in this depressive rumination, these cycles. You need to stop the way that your thought patterns are and stuff like that. Like these very specific um
Mhm.
messages came to me of ways that I could avoid suffering that I was causing myself through both physical and mental behaviors that had become, just habit, for me that I wasn't intentional or aware of. So it was this really strange, overwhelming experience. And like said, it was like this blinding light thing and very peaceful, very kind of ecstatic experience. And so I'm there and I got this feeling like that old self, that body, that mind with all those issues. Here they are. It was like they laid out all my failures, all my issues. It was all just like right there for me. And it was like, but it's okay. Because that self is dead. He's dead. He's gone. You don't have to worry about that. You have a new chance here. And it was like this very specific message of like, you don't have to go back to the old ways of living. You don't have to go back to the old ways of thinking. Here's what you were doing wrong. You have a new chance, make the best of it. And I was like, no, I just want to stay here. I'm good. This is awesome.
Yeah.
I was
Yeah,
like,
I bet.
I'm good. I can go to heven now. I
Yeah.
can stay here with you.
Right.
Uh, and I got this very specific message like, no, 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 it's not time for that. You're going back. And then it was like, boom, back in my body. Like
Wow.
all of a sudden it was over. And I'm like, whoa, what in the world happened? Uh, you know?
Okay. Okay. I got two questions really quick before I lose them.
Yeah,
And it's actually specific. It's not really two. I guess it's just one question in regards to two situations in your life. Did you know before your accident, did you know anything about, like, if you were to consider yourself more atheist, or a non-believer, we can use, sometimes I don't even like to use the word atheist because atheist is so
sure.
broad, but a
Yeah. Yeah.
non-believer, did you have any idea about the NDEs? Like, have you researched near-death experiences and been into spirituality and near-death experiences before any of that? No.
No, no. I was not interested in any of that kind of stuff. Just
Okay.
didn't care. Yeah.
Right. Right. So it wasn't even something you'd be like, hey, I'm gonna go home from work and watch some videos on near-death experiences. You were like, no, no, you weren't into that. Okay.
No, yeah, not at all.
Okay. Okay.
This was like totally out of left field for me. I was like, I didn't even know what to make of any of it. I was so confused, and I was like,
Right.
I don't know what to do. I just met God, I think. It was
Mhm.
like, but I don't
Yeah.
believe in that. It was so I was really
Yeah.
uh disoriented, kind of, for a bit, but in a good way.
Yeah,
If
in a good way. And same with so yeah, and that was the accident. And it's interesting. You're right. You almost talk about like the accident up to your the plant medicine experience almost as one big moment. It's interesting to hear
Yeah.
the way you talk because it's like you put it all into that one time in your life, which is really interesting. Because I was going to ask, had you researched it after you had almost had an accident, but you still weren't into it? You were still a non-believer. You had that blackout moment, and you probably phased it out as maybe just part of the brain or dying brain or something. I don't know. I'm assuming because
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
didn't question it. It doesn't sound like why you had that darkness and back moment. Okay. So you never had any of those. And the reason why it's interesting what happened to you with this was a way for you to prove to yourself. This to me, I mean, the thing that came to me while you were explaining it is that it was a healing, that
Oh yeah. Yeah.
you had a massive mental and physical healing through your experience. And and it's so in resemblance to what people have during NDEs.
Yeah.
It's mind-boggling because it's the
I know.
same thing, right? Like maybe minus some more heavenly realm type things that you haven't
Yeah.
explained. I don't, but the general consensus of getting the downloads, getting the thoughts coming to you, specific messages for you to take back with you. Now, someone might say, even someone who's not a believer might say, well, it's still you. It's still your brain coming up with these things. And possibly, but it seems to me when I hear you talk about it, you feel like it was a higher self or godly type influence. Is that, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is that how it feels?
Yeah. I mean, it was, if it was coming from some part of my brain, it was a part I had never had any access to because I had been stuck in these patterns of physical and mental behavior that were really detrimental to my well-being, and I couldn't even see that. I wasn't even aware of that before. It wasn't like I was aware of it and still stuck like like an addict or something like that, or I
Right.
just was totally blind to these certain habits I had that were causing me both physical and mental suffering. And it was like very plainly like, these are your problems. So I don't know if that was coming from inside me. I don't know, because it was totally outside anything I had ever thought about or had any perspective on.
And you don't recall
So
being told about these things that could help heal you, with
no.
the, like, these were completely new ideologies coming to you that you hadn't been told during your suffering. These were new things to try.
Yeah, I didn't even know, like, for instance, the word like depressive rumination. Like, I get that's like the psychological term for what I was doing before, which is where you get stuck in like a negative cycle of thoughts in your head that you like can't stop.
Mhm.
I didn't even know that that was like the word for that. It was like that was my experience. And then later, as I was doing research, reading about psychology and stuff, I was like, oh, this is what, those things were that I was experiencing before.
Is that the idea of like someone can either have a really terrible illness and or a bad accident or something really bad, and even though that time has passed, maybe they got over the illness or they've healed from the trauma of the accident, they're still stuck in that pattern of I'm still injured, so they're still creating pain, either through the brain or whatever's going on. Is that the same kind of mindset, almost like mind body perspective type healing? I don't
Yeah,
know.
that's part of it. Yeah, that's definitely part of it. Part of it is just when people get really depressed, you can start having like negative thoughts about not just the past, but also the future, like worry that you can't control. Like you keep worrying about something,
Mm,
but you can't stop that like process. And you just kind of feel like, oh, this is going to go wrong. This is going to go wrong. That's going to happen. And you get stuck in this kind of negative spiral or cycle. And I had no control over my mental space basically before this point. Like
right.
my mind was just like running amok and doing its own thing, and I
Hmm.
had no control over it. So I would get stuck in anxious episodes, or I would have depressive rumination. I would just be stuck there. I had no tools to break myself out of those loops. And
Wow.
that's where those things like mindfulness and stuff really came in to help.
And that was through the mindfulness practice you started doing. And I'm assuming as you came out of this, you kind of were like, "Whoa!" It's before you tell me what happened after that. The interesting thing that you said was that when you came back with these ideas of how to heal yourself, and because you were more science driven, less spiritually driven. Again, I'm not trying to say the way you were as a person, but
Yeah, yeah.
maybe you brought that back to prove to yourself that you had this experience, because for
Mhm,
me, it was the same thing with me. I would never say I was ever atheist. And I've always been very spiritual since a young kid.
mm,
But there's always been that part of me that's like, but do I really know? Like, do I really know? And up until a moment in my life, and I haven't shared it really much, but and I won't go into detail, but it was just a moment I had with another person. So I
mm.
had a spiritual experience where both me and another person saw the exact same thing at the same moment. And I came out of that and kind of lost my mind for about 3 hours. Like
Yeah,
I didn't know what was going on. My whole reality had shifted.
sure.
Where the other person was like used to that. So they didn't really haven't, they weren't like as thrown off, but I had to go like lay down. Like I had to
Yeah,
go
yeah,
and lay down with it.
yeah,
And to this day now, I can, because I had an experience with someone else, I can say, did that happen? And get that, because sometimes I doubt it still. I still have
yeah,
doubt. And that's how it worked for me. I don't know if that makes sense. So for you,
yeah,
the way it worked for you was you came back, did these things, and you're like, what? Like that's helping me. This is I'm healing or whatnot. I think that's kind of the
yeah,
same kind of concept. It was a way to almost provability to yourself that something happened.
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it didn't end there. So this is one of the weirdest
Okay.
experiences ever in my life. And I've only talked about it, I think, once or twice before, but I think this is a good channel for this topic, so we can kind of dive into this. But
Yeah, I'd love to.
after that experience, with the plant medicine psilocybin, so that ended. It was a weekend that we did that. And then so back on Monday, I like go back to my normal routine, right? At this time I was working as a Uber driver. So I went out and I drove people around all day. I came home, made dinner for myself and my partner like I always did, my normal routine. And then it was like there was this crazy energy that was just inside of me and like just had to express itself. Yeah, I felt like I don't know, like there was some kind of spiritual energy that just needed to express itself through me. And so I didn't know what to do about this. I've never experienced any feeling like this before or since. Um, and so after my day, I would just sit down at my computer and open up a blank document and just start writing. And the closest thing I can, relate this to is like when people talk about like channeled writing,
Mhm.
you know, that seems to be basically what was going on. It was like this energy inside me had to get out and express itself in writing, and I had no idea what I was writing. So I would just sit down at my computer, open up a document, and this paragraph of words would just kind of flow out of me, right? Just boom onto
Mhm.
the page.
Mhm.
And I would look at these things and just not even understand what I'm reading. Like it was like language I didn't even understand, about like subjects I didn't really know much about. And so I was like, okay, that's cool. But it was like I had to do that every day for like a week. So like all week, Monday through Friday, I do my thing, my normal routine. I come home, I make dinner, do blah, blah, blah. And then I sit down at my computer and write. And I'd never done this before in my life. I had written before, but I'd never like had to. I'd never felt like compelled to do it. And I'd
Mhm.
never experienced anything where like the writing was just happening and I had no idea what I was even saying. It was totally coming from somewhere else. I don't know where. And it was like these messages to me of like what to do now. It was like I was getting these very specific directions.
Mm. Okay.
Um, and so I wrote those down. I didn't know what to do with them. And so I was like, okay, there's some weird terms here, some concepts. I'm not really sure what these are. And so I went to a local used bookstore and I went back to their like philosophy and spirituality section. And I just started browsing around. I was like, I don't know what to make of this experience. I really don't know what to make of these like writings, channeled writing things that are happening to me, and the stuff they're talking about. So, maybe I can pick up a couple books that can help me sort this out, right? And so I picked up this amazing book by Aldous Huxley called The Perennial Philosophy. And it's just, if you want an introduction to, uh, the kind of perennial spirituality, I don't think there's a better book out there.
Wow.
And I was familiar with Aldous Huxley because I liked his sci-fi books. I was really into fantasy and sci-fi when I was younger. So I'd read Brave New World. I'd read Island, and I really liked Huxley. And I was like, oh, he has a book on philosophy. That's cool. So I got that. And in the Perennial Philosophy, he shows how there are certain aspects of all these different spiritual movements and religions that are very similar and relate. And so he shows, between like Vedanta and Christian mysticism and Kabbalah and Sufism and all these different mystical traditions, how they have a lot of the same beliefs and practices and stuff like that. Um, and so the book introduced me to like hundreds of different mystics and philosophers and all this kind of stuff. And so what I would do is I'd be like, oh, this is a really cool quote, from this certain philosopher or whatever. And then I would look him up and then I would like buy one of that person's books and, start reading that.
Right.
And so I went down this like crazy rabbit hole. And it started me on this trend that's been continuing ever since for the last 8 years now, where I've just been reading every book on like philosophy and spirituality and like, religious history and stuff like that I can get my hands on.
Wow. So, okay, so you just started connecting differently to your surroundings. That's what it sounds like to me. Like you immediately were going out and seeking answers to what was going on. So you had these things
Yeah.
happening, but you're like, I need to kind of try to make sense of all of this because it
Yeah.
seemed to be like it just kind of continued after. So this wasn't just you had that experience and then you're like, wow, that was trippy, cool, I'm gonna go tell my
Yeah.
buddies, and then just like you just moved on with your life. No, like this kept going, is by the sounds of it.
Yeah, and actually I didn't tell my friends because I had no idea what to make of it, and none of my friends were religious or anything, and they all knew me as this like guy who was not, religious and not into spirituality and stuff. So I didn't say anything for a long time because I just didn't even know what to say. What am I going to say? Hey, I saw God, I don't know. So,
Right. Right.
so I didn't know what to make of
Wow.
it. So yeah, I went to the bookstore and I got that book by Aldous Huxley, and the other book I picked up um was by a guy named Swami Vivekananda. So I don't know if you've done much reading in Indian philosophy or anything like that,
I have
but
not. No.
no. Okay.
No.
So Swami Vivekananda's huge figure in Indian history. They have a national holiday named after him. There's like colleges and hospitals and all kinds of things named after him in India. And he was the main disciple of a guy by the name of Ramakrishna, who was a 19th century Hindu saint. They consider him like an avatar, like one of the greatest Indian saints ever, essentially. And his main disciple was this guy, Vivekananda, who grew up in British India. And so he was fluent in both English and whatever other language he spoke. Forget which Indian language he spoke. And so he was one of the first people to actually come from India to the West and actually teach yoga and Vedanta in America. He actually came at the 1893 Chicago World Religion Expo or whatever they had. They had a big conference for all the religious leaders from all over the world. And it was the first time that Hinduism was actually represented in the West as a major religion. And it was represented by Vivekananda. So that's why he's a national hero in India, because they see him as the person who brought their great spiritual tradition to the rest of the world.
Okay.
And so he translated Patanjali's Yoga Sutras into English, and he taught yoga. Yoga had basically disappeared both in India and everywhere else. And he's the one who brought it to us. So everything we have,
Wow.
in the West here, as far as Hinduism, Vedanta, yoga, he was the first person to come and teach it. And he traveled all over the US. He had to come by steamboat from India, like,
Right. Right.
right.
Yeah.
And then he traveled all over the US by train and stuff teaching yoga. And so I learned very like old school yoga from him, from his teachings. And so I started taking that up as a really serious practice, the 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 full version of yoga, not just the kind of postures and stuff that people do here, but the meditation, the spirituality, the ethics of yoga. And so I got really into that. And I found it was a really great pursuit. And they're very like technical and kind of scientific about their spirituality when it comes to yoga. And I liked that because I was coming from this, kind of very scientific background. And so it really appealed to me. Um, and so I got really into yoga for several years. I studied I have like 3 translations of the Yoga Sutras on top of uh, Vivekananda's books on yoga. I got a
Interesting.
few copies of the Bhagavad Gita. I got every other, Mahabharata, the other Indian scriptures, and I started really digging into those. And I had like a Indian phase, I guess.
Yeah. That seems really interesting. This is a great place for me to bring this topic up. When you're talking about yoga, the interesting thing with me is over the years, I mean, I love fitness. I love doing things and working out and all these things. And I've been part of programs where there's a lot of, calisthenics, weight
Mm,
training, these types of things, and you do these things. And then it gets to a yoga day. And I have found that when I do these things, I get to the yoga day and I go, oh, nah, I'm just gonna skip this day. I'm gonna skip the yoga day. Like, what's the point? I'm just gonna sit here and stretch my body out and then just kind of move on. And I've done that so many times in different programs I've been part of. And so I started questioning myself and saying, why am I avoiding yoga? Like, what is it?
mm,
What is causing me to not want to do yoga? And then my brain goes, oh, because I mean, it's not going to help you gain muscle. It's not good for your cardio. And my brain starts to try to make sense of what I'm
hmm.
coming to terms with yoga. And then, I picture, a bunch of, maybe it's not as masculine to get into yoga, or
Sure.
there's all these different things, these automatic things that come into my brain. And I can't tell you the number of people who've told me, like in this new spiritual community I'm kind of building around myself with people I'm talking to, how important meditation is and how important yoga has been to them. I
Hmm.
go, what are people getting out of yoga? So if you got so deep into it, I'm just curious to ask you, what when you so if you think about if you've done fitness too, right? Or sports or anything like that,
Hmm.
you walk away from, say, a cardio, a good bike ride, say you go for a half hour, an hour bike ride, you get back, you're like, you feel it, you're exhausted. Or
Yeah.
some calisthenics, you feel it in your muscles, or there's this feeling afterwards that you get like, oh, I've completed something that's good for my body.
Yeah.
What is the feeling you get after yoga or a yoga moment, and why did it keep having you come back to it? If you can explain that a bit.
Yeah, so it's very much related to the mindfulness thing. So, that's why I like to talk about the deeper aspects of yoga rather than just the postures and stuff. So the benefits from yoga don't come from just doing certain stretches and holding positions. The benefits come from the mind body connection that you get in yoga, because what you should be doing is every movement should be coupled with a breath, either in or out. And you should know, like, I breathe out when I do this movement, I breathe in when I do this movement. And so your entire mind and body should be totally focused on the movements and on your body. So it should bring you out of your thinking narrative mind and totally into just experiencing your body and moving into your breath. And so that's why when you do yogic meditation, you focus on your breath, is what you do as well. And so it's the same thing. It's a practice to learn to control your mind. So when I was talking
Mm.
about earlier, before I had these experiences, I had no control over my mental space. My mind was just running amok all the time, doing whatever it wanted, and I was just along for the ride. But mindfulness and yoga allowed me to find ways, and breathwork as well, which is all very similar. It all allowed me to, if I needed to, stop that mental process, whatever it is, and shift it to something else. So it's one of the reasons I really like yoga and why I think it's such a beneficial practice. The ethics that are involved when you study what's called the yama and the niyama, or the do's and don'ts of yoga, are also extremely beneficial. So the ancient system of yoga is a lifestyle. It's not just a practice, it's an entire lifestyle. And what that lifestyle is geared towards is calmness. It's
Mm.
geared towards being able to quiet and still your mind. Because the entire point of yoga, as Patanjali says, is to still the movements of the mind. And what happens when you're actually able to still your mind is that you can then perceive your real self, is what they say, your actual higher self. Because when your mind is constantly moving, constantly active and fluttering and moving back and forth, it's like a pond or something that's being agitated and there's ripples across it and you can't really see through it. But once you are able to still that for a second, the water clears and you can see through that, and you can actually see and experience your higher self or God or source or whatever you want to call it. So that's the point of yoga, is actually to have profound spiritual experiences by learning to um, change your mind from narrative mind to body awareness, and withdraw your senses and your mind and everything, and still it so that you can perceive higher realities that you can't perceive otherwise.
So my own ignorance of not knowing and growing up not understanding the true
Sure.
benefit of yoga and seeing that it was just this movement people stretched out and did
Hmm.
downward
Hmm.
dog with
Hmm.
is from not knowing, really. I mean, this is the first I've had little people have mentioned it in little sprinkles, but you just explained it so well. So I thank you for that. So it's more of a
Yeah.
connection to your higher self. It's almost like at somewhere along the line, some of us forgot the true meaning of yoga, right? So we have the
Oh yeah.
meditation side of things, but yoga in itself is a meditative practice, is what you're saying. And if you can
It's a
combine,
lifestyle.
it's a
Yeah. So
lifestyle.
there's ethics within yoga. They say don't lie, don't steal, don't harm others. Ahimsa is a really famous ethical word that comes, a Sanskrit word that comes from yoga, ahimsa, and it means do no harm. And so there's all these ethical provisions, and the reason for that is that when you lie to people, that causes internal tension and external tension with that person. And so now every time you talk to them, you have to remember your lie, and and so you can't still your mind when that kind of stuff is going on, or if you steal from someone, now you're going to have that inner guilt, and your mind's not going to be clear. So it's a whole lifestyle meant to provide you with clearness and calmness so that you can act more intentionally and less reactively, and connect, yeah, with a higher self as well.
And so yoga after this experience was something you really dived into, and have you kept it up since? Like
Mhm.
this is something, how often do you practice yoga?
Every day. Yeah, so what I did is I started with yoga and studying their beliefs and practices, and practicing, studying the scriptures, and then doing the practices a lot, every day for years. And then what I did is I went to a different tradition. So I went on to Sufism, which is a mystical Islamic tradition. And I started studying their beliefs and practices and doing their practices, breath work and meditative and prayer practices and stuff for years. For a few years, I did that as well. I like totally immersed myself in that. And then I went on to Kabbalah, which is a Jewish mysticism practice, and then Christian mysticism. And so I've been studying what all of these saints, sages, mystics, all these people who are really revered throughout history for being very virtuous, prolific writers, these kind of philosophers, these kind of things. I studied what they were doing
Mhm.
and what they believed, not just what they believed or what they wrote, but what were they doing? What were their practices like? And so I learned all of those, tried them, did them the way that, they described for years. And then I took everything I learned and related it back to my home spiritual tradition of Christianity, and adapted all these practices into my own system of practices that fit within, my belief system or whatever, my structure, worldview, whatever. And I developed a whole system of rituals and ceremonies and routines to keep up the practices and fit them into my life in a way that makes sense.
Right.
So I actually created my blog, and I would share my practices there. I wrote a whole big post on yoga. It was the first post on my blog
Nice.
about all of this specifics. So if anyone wants to learn real traditional yoga, like the ethics, the philosophy, the spirituality of yoga, I have a whole big post on that, and I have a video on it too. Two videos on it on my YouTube channel that goes really deep into that for anyone who wants to learn more.
What
Um,
is the, just before you continue, what is the
yeah,
website for your blog? Like what's the best way to contact with you?
it's just my name.com. So justinberkoltz.com.
Okay,
Yeah.
and
And
is
then
that
same thing for YouTube.
that's the
Uh,
same thing with your YouTube.
just
Okay.
Justin Birkholz if you just search me. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, perfect. And so you did this as a practice. I was thinking to myself, as a human being, as living in this world, we are all results oriented people. We like
Hmm.
to see results. So
Yeah.
I'm listening to your story. Some of my audience may be listening to your story, and I'm thinking, wow, that takes dedication to be putting that much time and effort into something like yoga and doing this as a practice,
Yeah.
as a regular daily practice. One would assume you were seeing results as you were going through this, whether that's
Mhm.
mind healing, physical, mental. Is that, am I assuming something? Or like, because for me, I usually only continue something. Same with this podcast. It keeps growing. I keep
Yeah.
doing it. People want to hear what people have to
Yeah.
say. I keep bringing guests on. If it just kept flopping and it never went anywhere, eventually I'd say, oh, well, maybe this isn't the thing. It's kind of like results are key. And so like, what results were you getting? If you don't mind sharing, like what were you
Yeah.
getting out of it when you first started going into this?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of different things. Being able to take control of my mind and being in control of my mental space, like I was saying, that was probably the biggest benefit, because when your mind is just controlling you and you're being reactive to anxiety or whatever, depression, whatever, you're really not in control of your life at all. You know, and it just caused me a lot of suffering that was totally unnecessary. So it was like this total night and day once I was able to actually take control of my mind again. And then what that turned into was being able to then use my mental space to do these long, complex contemplations and carry out, you know, deeper kind of thought processes that are intentional rather than just having whatever thoughts flowing through my head. I could use hours of a day to actually pursue a certain thought and really, really pursue it deeply. And that has such deeply transformative effects on you when you're able to, you know, explore a certain concept or thought without getting sidetracked, without getting swept away, and really dive into it and sit with it for a long time, for like days or weeks, even sometimes. Um, you know, you have these insights into your behavior, into the way that other people behave, into the way the world is, and it really changes your ability to live intentionally and to explain yourself to people. My ability to articulate myself improved greatly
Mm.
as well, you know, because I had more control over my mental processes and stuff. So there were a lot of benefits that I saw. But one of the most interesting was I hadn't said anything to anyone about the experience or about any of my new practices or books I was reading or anything. And I was at a party a few months after I had that plant medicine experience. And I remember one of my friends sitting next to me on the couch, and something was going on. He was like, "Doesn't that bother you? Like, aren't you like upset about this? What's happening over here?" And I was sitting there, no, no, I'm really not. You know, I was like, I don't know, they're their own people. They're doing their thing. I'm really not like that. And he just looked at me and he went, "What? What's going on with you? What's different? What changed?"
Right, right.
You know? And he was just looking at me like, "You're not the same kind of like anxious, dude you were before." And I
Mhm.
remember that very clearly. So that was kind of fun.
So
But
your
yeah, there were
external,
a lot of benefits I
yeah, so
saw.
your external, your friend group, your family, whoever it would have been, may have noticed some changes in you just based on
Oh yeah.
your own your behavior, you know. I think a lot of us get caught in that. It's I think a lot of us are walking around and reacting and building anxieties, building illness, building all these different
Mm,
things inside of us because we don't know how to control the mind, even though like we have this feeling like I'm saying I'm the same way as a busy person. Music is my
mm.
mindfulness really. When I was writing it, I also connected with that when you said you just kept writing. When I write music, I don't know where it comes from. When I'm
Yeah.
in those good places, that's the
Mhm.
same thing. When I'm not in those good places, I'm not writing, I'm not in my music, then I get kind of really busy in my mind. And I think a
Yeah,
good practice like yoga or something could be really good for a lot of people. Did you find physical improvements at all? Like, did your physical health
yeah,
continue to improve? And I was curious about that.
definitely. It did. Yeah, yeah. I used to be very inflexible, you know, very stiff all the time. And now I can sit and meditate in lotus position very easily. You know, which most people here in the West can't even sit like that. And I couldn't. It took me like 9 months of practice to be able to sit in lotus position and meditate, you know, just slowly inching my legs closer and closer every day. So
Right.
you know, I've really dedicated a lot of time to the practices, but I've seen tremendous improvements in my health and well-being, physically, mentally, you know. And then there's the other aspects to it that, you know, harder to explain, but you know what people talk about, like manifesting or something like that.
Mm,
um there was a point when I remember very clearly, I had been studying all these mystical spiritual practices for quite some time, and I was introduced to what people would think of as like magic or Western esotericism or occultism. And I immediately dismissed it when I first heard about it. I was like, "Oh, that's all nonsense. You know, I don't. There can't be anything valuable there." But I heard someone's personal story who has a horrible story. He was falsely imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. He spent 18 years in jail, a lot of that in solitary confinement.
Wow.
It's just totally tragic story. This guy named Damien Eccles. And I was listening to his story, and he said, I tried Zen Buddhism, I tried all this other meditation and blah, blah, blah. And what gave him the most comfort and what helped him the most through this awful time was this magical practice. And so I thought, okay, maybe I should, be less biased against this and give it a second thought, give it another view. And so I bought this crazy book called The Golden Dawn, which is like this giant like Bible of magical practices from like the late 19th century. It's like too far back. I went too far, too original or whatever. And I was like, this is madness. But it opened up a whole new way of seeing reality. And immediately after I started these practices, weird things started to happen where I got exactly the job I needed and wanted at exactly the right time when I wasn't even looking. I wasn't even applying for jobs. Someone came to me and said, hey, are you happy at your job? I'm like, not really. Like, oh, well, we have this position for you. And it was absolutely perfect. Literally the timing couldn't have been better. And then things like that kept happening and have continued to happen for the last few years now, that I've had this practice that I totally dismissed at first. But what I found when I looked into the Western esoteric traditions is that they were actually drawing from a lot of these mystical traditions that I'd already studied. So it's all based on like Kabbalah and yoga and Christian mysticism, but they were combining these practices with symbols and with rituals in very specific ways to induce certain altered states of consciousness within very specific parameters that cause people to be extremely inspired, enlivened, invigorated. And so all these people who are practicing magic are like well-known poets, filmmakers, like prolific authors, and all these people who had done this practice. And I was like, something they're doing is causing them to be extremely inspired and creative. And I'm absolutely convinced that it's the practices, both the symbols and the act of creating and interpreting the symbols, and the rituals themselves, because the rituals involve colors, specific instances, specific movements,
Wow.
meditations, all this kind of stuff. It's all combined.
Mm-hmm.
And so magic gave me the format to be able to take everything I had learned for the last like 5 to 7 years I've been studying and practicing, and start combining them into concrete, specific rituals that have really powerful effects. And so that's when I wrote my books. My first book, Foundations, talks about specific rituals that you can do that combine things like gratitude, meditation, yoga, breath work, prayer, etc., into a very set ritual that kind of tries to check all the boxes and make it as easy as possible to implement all of those beneficial habits into your day in a way that's really easy to do so. And then I took it farther. So my second book focused on phases of the moon and doing rituals for each phase of the moon and working with those waxing and waning lunar energies and how to work with those energies to be more productive and be more inspired and all this kind of stuff. So that's what I've been
Wow.
working on now for the last few years, is kind of taking all of that study and practice and combining it into ways that I can use myself, that my partner can use, and we can do in group settings sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
and then that I can teach to other people who want to, transform their lives. I can say, well, here's what I've learned from studying thousands of years of history and spiritual practice and belief. Here are the things that seem to, uh, work well for people. And here are some ways that you can adapt them to your own beliefs, your own religion, your own non-religion, if that's, the case. And so that's really what my work and my books have been about these last few years.
That's fascinating. What's the name of the second book you wrote?
Luna.
Oh, it's
So
called Luna. Okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
this guy right here.
oh, nice. Nice.
Yeah, this is Luna. And then the first one's Foundations right behind me here as
Oh, okay. I
well.
see that one. And those are those both are those on your website? There's links to where people can
Mm-hmm.
get those and things like
Yeah,
that.
those are for sale on my website. There's links on my YouTube videos if anyone wants to, like down at the bottom of the description.
Yeah.
So people can kind of support me that way. And
Yeah.
they're workbooks. So each one is a 30-day program, or well, the lunar one is a lunar month, so it's only 28 days.
Right.
But it's a month-long program, and it shows you how to implement these habits into your life in kind of like a step-by-step fashion. So like you implement some, and then the next week, and it has checklists for you, like daily, so you know which practices to do. And then each day has a personal like poem or parable or other writing that I wrote included with that for like daily inspiration. And then it
Wow.
has a couple other practices that it covers as well, as far as like tracking your energy and setting up daily prayers and things like that.
This seems
So,
very interactive. The interesting thing that
yeah,
you were saying about all the work you've been doing with that and the magic information you said really is a lot of mind stuff. It's like really the way we're using our mind. That's what manifestation comes from, right? And what is our mind? Is our mind our brain? No, I think it's bigger than that. And I think we're starting to
yeah,
understand that
yeah.
it becomes bigger.
For people who want to make some changes in their life, who want to incorporate really beneficial habits that have been proven both, by spiritual masters and scientifically. I talk about cognitive science in the book a lot, in my first book, anyways. I talk about the work of a professor named John Vervaeke, who's a really big cognitive science professor, and I talk about Jamie Wheel, who's a guy who studies flow, and I talk about Andrew Huberman, and I talk about all of their work. So it's both scientific and spiritual, because I like to make the argument from both sides. I like to argue to people like, hey, spiritual and creative people have been doing these practices and believing these ways, and they've had these benefits. And now science is showing us that that might be because of these psychological
Mm,
and cognitive factors, right? So
right,
that way, I'm trying to appeal to anyone who's spiritually or scientifically minded, because I'm both
right,
personally, because I've had both like phases, and now I'm very much both. The
right.
whole goal of the book is for people to go through it
Mhm.
and add beneficial habits to their lives.
And I love that. And I love how it's a workbook. It does seem like a really fascinating way you've done it because it seems like you're almost trying to grab people's hands and kind of bring
Yeah,
along the journey with it. That's what a workbook's like. You think when
yeah,
you're a kid, you
yeah.
get your workbook out and you kind of go through
Hmm.
it, right? So that's really neat. I really like that you're
Yeah.
doing that. With everything you went through, right? You went through the car accident, you went through this experience with plant medicine and those 2 years that were I can't imagine and the just the recovery of that and then looking at where you are now and be able to probably sit a lot longer than I can. I'll tell you that much. Like just from a physical standpoint, like obviously you've come a long ways. And if you look at it the way you were before, and I were to say to you, are you afraid not of the death process of but of what comes after this life? Do you have a fear of that now with all the things you've experienced in your life in comparison to before?
No, no, not at all. Um, I'm not in any way convinced that I know what happens. I don't. Some people are very confident about that.
Yeah.
I'm not. Uh, but whatever it is, I'm pretty certain that this phase is preparation
Mm,
for some reason. I'm not sure why or what we're really supposed to learn or prepare for here, but I have the feeling that this is just preparation for something bigger, for our souls to learn limitations, for our souls to learn suffering, for us to get perspective, and then move to a higher place where maybe we're not as constrained by those things, but that we have a greater appreciation for that lack of constraint, something like that.
wow.
So I'm pretty convinced that whatever happens is going to be a whole lot more interesting than what's going on here, even though I think life here is beautiful. I love our
Absolutely.
planet. I'm all about nature and connecting with people and enjoying our physical life, but
Mhm.
I do think there's something even better out there.
I love that. I love the way you said that. And it might tie into the last question, but the before I get to that one, even with your experience of, because you said, you don't want to say you know all the answers, because we don't all. I don't think anyone that I'd ever talked to would know all the answers.
Yeah.
But you did have an experience that definitely felt, a couple experiences that felt outside of this existence in a way. Is that true to say? Like, it didn't feel like you and I talking right now. It was something that was different from that. It felt different.
I've had a few of those. Yeah, I've had a few of those and a few since. Not quite as powerful, but I've had a few of those experiences where it definitely seemed like a different dimension or plane of reality or whatever. I don't know how to explain it necessarily, but it was a very different experience than normal, 3D life. Yeah.
Right. And kind of ties into the last thing you said. The last question I always ask everybody is why you think we incarnate here? Why do you think human beings come here?
Yeah. Yeah, well, like I said, I think it's in preparation for something. One of the other saints who I follow, his name's Bawa Muhyiddin. He's the only Sufi saint to have a shrine in North America. He came to America in like the 1970s, and he ended up spending the rest of his life here. Really amazing person. If you want to look into the most mysterious person of the 20th century, I think. No one knows when he was born or how old he was. He just came out of the jungles of Sri Lanka at one point as the spiritual master. Um, he has this saying where he says that it's a school, but it's also a play. So it's a place to learn, but also to act and try different roles. And so it's like a theater play, but also for learning. And so
Mm,
I like that, because if it's just school, it's almost too serious, and he's
yeah.
trying to tell you it's not that serious. It's also about playing and testing things and learning that way. And so I think that's really good for people to keep in mind. And all the real spiritual masters always come to that playful kind of attitude. Like, if you ever seen like the Dalai Lama, that dude's always joking around, you
Yeah.
know, making people laugh and stuff. I think I think play is a big part of learning. And I think
Mm,
that, if you have children, when they play with each other, they're learning. They're learning boundaries. They're learning how to socialize. They're learning all these things. But as adults, we often stop playing and we think that it's not important. We got to work. We got to make our money. We got to pay the bills or whatever. But I think the point of life is to play with each other
yeah.
and learn that way.
That like really struck home, and it's true. I have a 2-year-old daughter right now, and like I
Okay.
always look forward to every day when we're like going doing crazy things, because like
Yeah.
she reminds me that I'm human, and that I'm like that. At 2 years old, they're not thinking of where you're gonna get your next like piece of bread or anything. They're just like, hey, do this one thing, and we'll
Yep.
have. So I think you're right. As adults, we do forget. We forget, so often. So I would encourage people to go out there and play. I used to always say, like, it's too bad all jobs didn't have like recess, where everybody would go out and throw a ball around, or like just do
Yeah. Play
something.
some volleyball or
Like,
something.
why do
Yeah,
why do
exactly.
we get rid of that? I don't understand why everything has to get so serious. So I think you're right. I totally that school of, it's a school and a play, are two things I get a lot from the NDE experience. A
Mm.
lot of people say both or combined,
Yeah.
being their feeling of reason why we're here, and to love, and to show compassion to
Yeah.
one another and those types of things too. But I really like the way that you said that, how it's a school and a play. And that's from, what was the name of that person that you mentioned?
His name is Bawa, so Bawa, and then his last name is Muhyiddin. That's let's see, Muhayyaddeen. He's
Yeah.
a really fascinating figure, and I keep a book of his in my nightstand called The Wisdom of Man, and it's like a couple of lectures and a letter that he wrote combined into a book, and it's just full of the most amazing spiritual insights. And he has tons and tons of stuff that's been published. He didn't ever publish anything. He just spoke to people. Like people would go and sit, and he would sit and just speak for like 12 hours, and they would
Oh, wow.
record it. So they have thousands of hours of recordings of this guy, and they have been slowly translating them. They have a few scholars because he spoke some weird language like not many people speak. Um, and so they have these scholars that have been translating his recordings and then publishing them as books. So the one that I really like is called The Wisdom of Man. And I have that by my bedside so that at night I take it out and read a few passages before I go to bed, to fill my mind with, positive thoughts and spiritual thoughts to contemplate as I go to bed. That way it shifts my mindset going to sleep so that I have a better mindset while I'm asleep, and then a better mindset when I wake up in the morning.
I do want to say it's really amazing. First of all, I want to thank you again for being on the show today. It's amazing to hear the different practices that you have. Like, I'm also learning from everyone I speak with, and
Yeah.
I'm watching this person who I've never met in my in life until now, and you indicate that you were this other person before the accident, and the accident itself sounds like this horrific moment, but if you look
Oh
at
yeah.
it now, it completely shifted you as a human, and you think, well, I mean, I don't want everyone to go out there and have an accident.
Yeah. Yeah.
If we can find a way to get there without having to experience that wake up call, to do it in a different way and a little lighter way, I think that's
Mhm.
what we all want. But it's amazing to see the different practices you put in your life, the things that you've done in order to get to where you're at. So I just want to acknowledge that and thank you again for
Yeah.
talking to everybody today.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's the point. That's exactly the point of my books and my blog and YouTube and stuff is I went through this horribly traumatic, painful experience, and that ended up in an awesome transformation for me. But that doesn't have to be the case, for everyone. You can have powerful transformative experiences without going through pain. For a lot of people, it is the pain that causes it. It's very common. Um, I've talked to a lot of people about that, but it doesn't have to be that way. There are other paths, and so that's really what my books and blog and stuff are about. Is hey, if you want this kind of transformation, here's some scientifically and spiritually proven methods to get there.
Right. Well, thanks so much. And I totally agree with you. I usually turn to the audience and say, thanks for sharing, liking, and subscribing to the Soul Inspired podcast. It's really the reason I do it, to get the message out. So please continue to share these stories, and they're really inspiring. And Justin, you've been awesome. I really appreciate having you on. Thank you so much for being on today.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff.